Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Peter Bragg, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Gluckman, University Distinguished Professor and Director of the Liggins Institute for Medical Research and the National Research Centre for Growth and Development at the University of Auckland. Professor Gluckman trained in paediatrics and endocrinology at the University of Otago, Auckland, and the University of California, San Francisco. In 2001, he was awarded New Zealand's highest scientific honour, the Rutherford Medal, and was New Zealander of the Year in 2004. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of London in 2001 and is the only New Zealander who is a foreign member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, 2004, and a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences of the UK, 2006. This evening he looks at the widening gap between how our bodies and our minds have evolved, the topic of another of his recently released books, also co-authored by Professor Hansen and entitled Mismatch, How Our World No Longer Fits Our Bodies, which is available after this talk. Please welcome Professor Peter Gluckman.
First of all, I want to thank you. If this was New Zealand on a lovely Saturday afternoon at 6 o'clock in summer, there wouldn't be many people attending a talk about evolutionary medicine, so thank you very, very much. We'll get to the topic of this evening, which is, of course, all related to the fact that 200 years ago, Charles Darwin was born, and 150 years ago, The Origin of Species was published. But at the beginning of one of Darwin's books is written the following in the preface. The purport of the following pages is an endeavour to reduce the facts belonging to animal life into classes, orders, genre and species, and by comparing with them with each other, unravel the theory of disease. Unravel the theory of disease. That was written in 1794 by Darwin, not Charles, but Erasmus, Charles's grandfather, who himself, and those of you who heard Michael Roos's lecture earlier on, will know that he was an considerable intellect in his own right, and one of the very early people to consider from a scientific perspective that one species may mutate into another. And it's interesting that in his first writings, in his great scientific poem, Zoonomia, Erasmus Darwin is arguing the whole purpose of evolutionary biology is to unravel the theory of disease. Darwin's father was a doctor. Darwin is probably the world's most famous medical school dropout. And he never, or virtually never, in all his writings, refers to human disease in relationship to developing his theories. There's minuscule reference to it across all his writings. And indeed, although a few medical schools in Central Europe taught a bit about evolution in the 19th century, even Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, who was the most influential educator in England in the late 19th century, argued doctors didn't need to know anything about evolution because it was not a practical subject. It had no relevance to understanding the human. And sadly, that's the way it's remained for the next 120, 130 years. But over the last 20 years, 10 years probably, a number of us have started to argue that evolutionary medicine, evolutionary biology, is as important to medicine as is pharmacology or physiology or anatomy or surgery or anything else. Because at the end of the day, evolutionary biology asks the why question. Why does something happen in biology? Whereas most of medicine has been focused on the how question. How does an infection, how do you get a fever? Bugs cause certain changes in your immune system that cause your body temperature to rise. They don't ask the question, why do you get a fever? And does that impact on how you might treat that fever? And we'll come back to that example perhaps if we have time. That's the origin of this book, in a sense. that there are different reasons why scientists try to write books for a lay audience, and we'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow. But at the end of the day, it's either to make money, and I'll never make money writing books, I don't think, although Charles Darwin, interestingly enough, really did well out of his book. As you know, The Origin of Species was a bestseller. First edition sold out on day one. The second edition had to be published 6 weeks later. He made a few corrections. There's about 10 sentences difference between the first edition and the second edition. And it also sold out very rapidly. And, of course, there were multiple printings. And before he died, there had been 6 editions. Although, sadly, if you ever read The Origin, please read the second edition. Without a doubt, it's the one that is closest to what Charles really thought was going on. I wrote this book because I think as you start to think about the evolutionary perspective on human existence, you realise that modern concepts of health and disease have been dominated by deterministic views of what is happening rather than holistic views. And that if you take an evolutionary perspective, one gets a broader perspective. And I hope I'll elucidate this with you over the next 20, 30 minutes. I tend to ramble on, so you might have to stop me at some point, I warn you. One of the interesting things about Charles Darwin was he was a transition between two forms of determinism. Before Charles, of course, there was the determinism of natural theology and all that went with natural theology in its different forms, that in fact humans' destiny was determined by some supernatural higher order. And while Charles wasn't responsible for it, 150 years later, we faced the new determinism. Genes solve everything. You know, there's the gene for heart disease, except if you read the newspaper, there's a new gene for heart disease every week, and there's a gene for diabetes, except there's a new one every 2 weeks, and there's a gene for diabetes, etc., etc., etc. But if you read between the hype of the papers, you realise that each of these genes contributes very little, if at all, really anything, to individual risk. You're as equally likely to have a gene for shopping as you are for heart disease, I would suggest to you. So we've gone from one form of determinism based on religious belief to another form of determinism in the late 1980s and all the hype around the Human Genome Project based on genetic determinism, the God of the gene. And of course it's not like that. Genes are important, but genes don't work in isolation. And a large part of this book is about pointing out that genes don't work in isolation, and there are echoes of our past in our genes which influence the way we live now. Evolution is fundamentally about change. I mean, the word is derived from the Greek word, I guess, or Latin. I'm no classical scholar, but clearly relating to change. We have 3 ways as organisms to respond to change. And that change happens on different time bases. The quickest is what scientists called homeostasis, that great brilliant concept developed by Claude Bernard, the French physiologist in the 19th century, whereby if we change our internal chemistry, say lower our blood sugar or raise our blood sugar or lower oxygen level, our body responds appropriately to try and keep things in a steady state or a semi-steady state. And so when you eat a meal or have a beer and you get a large glucose rush, your pancreas secretes more insulin to lower your blood sugar by pushing the blood sugar into the cells, so it can be used as the basis for energy, because glucose is ultimately your fuel supply for all your cells' body actions. That's homeostasis. If you're hot, you'll sweat. If you're cold, you'll shiver. It's all about trying to maintain a constant body temperature so your chemical reactions inside your body can work normally. And that's the magic of all organisms that they have some levels of homeostasis, and we have very complex homeostatic mechanisms which most medical students spend all their life learning in great detail, and of course much of medicine relates to manipulating it. At the other extreme we have what Charles Darwin discovered, which was the mechanisms of selection, both natural selection and sexual selection. Namely, if you have inherited traits or inherited features which make you more likely to survive in one environment more likely to be able to reproduce successfully in one environment than another, then those inherited traits will become magnified in the population, and over time the population of organisms will evolve, will change. And really, we've thought largely in terms of those two mechanisms of change. Selection, which operates over hundreds, if not thousands of generations by small incremental bits most of the time, and homeostasis, which is immediate. Now, my interest is in the intermediate. That is what happens in the life course between the time you're a fertilised egg and the time you're an adult human being, or the time you're a senile human being, which I'm fast approaching, but we won't go there today. We won't go there. The point I'm going to say, without going into a lot of detail now, is in the last 10 years, it's been discovered that in early life, and by early life, I mean as an embryo and as a fetus, the organism takes information from its mother, tries to predict the future it's going to have after it's born, and shifts its gene switches, the switches on its genes, a process we call epigenetics, so as to try and be more like the world it thinks it's going to live in, so it can be more successful in the world. If that prediction is right, it does very well. If that prediction is bad, it does very badly. Let me give you a simple example, not one from humans, because they'll get a little bit more, we'll come back to those momentarily. In Pennsylvania, there's a little animal called the meadow vole. It's a little rodenty thing that lives under the ground and in nests. And it can be born in spring, or it can be born in fall. I better use the American terminology, hadn't I? If it's born in spring, it's born with a thin coat of fur. If it's born in fall, it's born with a very thick coat of fur. And the thickness of its coat of fur it has when it's born is that it has for the rest of its life, which is about 9 months. So if it's born in spring, it's ready for that hot, humid Pennsylvania summer of about, 35 degrees in Celsius and very humid. It's got a thin coat of fur, it's not going to have trouble with heat, and it can reproduce successfully. But if it's born in fall, it's born with a thick coat of fur to put up with that 10 feet of snow and everything else that comes along in Pennsylvania. But at the time it's born, the temperature is exactly the same. And it's born into a nest where mother carefully sets it up in a way that it's perfectly the same. The temperatures are not different for several weeks after it's born. Yet already by the time it's born, the die is cast to have a thick coat of fur or have a thin coat of fur. And we now know that from the chemical signals the fetus is seeing from mother of where the days are getting longer, i.e. summer is coming, and therefore there's less melatonin being secreted by mother into her bloodstream, or where the days are getting shorter, that is what the fetus is detecting to forecast the environment it's going to be in, and lo and behold, it has a thick or a thin coat of fur. And believe it or not, something the same happens in human babies. In the first 3 months after we're born, the number of sweat glands we have for the rest of our life is determined. If babies are born in hot climates or warmer climates, they will grow up with more sweat glands. If babies are born in cold climates, they'll grow up with less sweat glands. Does it matter? Well, yes, it does. And it was found out by the Japanese in the Second World War when they were fighting the Australians in New Guinea. The soldiers who had been born in Hokkaido, which is the most northern part of Japan, all suffered heat stroke and could not fight. The only soldiers who could fight, and I'm exaggerating it, obviously there was overlap, against the Australians in Papua New Guinea, or it was New Guinea then, and in Indonesia, were those who had been born in Guam and Okinawa and in the more humid environment. They did not get as much heat stroke. This is the concept of fetal forecasting, which it's turning out, and you'll see over the next little while, turns out to be one of the most exciting new areas of biology. We call it epigenomics, beyond genomics. And it's because we now know that it involves the environment changing switches on the DNA, so the DNA changes the way it works for life. And the importance of that is we're getting away from genetic determinism. Because in fact there are ways you can change the way your genes will work simply by the way you develop. And I'm going to come back to that later on. The guts of my book is about there are a number of evolutionary pathways that are important in causing disease. One that you'll all be familiar with is antibiotic resistance. Why does antibiotic resistance happen? It's because bacteria evolve very rapidly because they have short generation times. Humans evolve very slowly, and therefore we put out antibiotics out there. Bacteria evolve ways to be resistant to the antibiotics, and lo and behold, we can't keep up with them inventing new antibiotics. And as you know now, there are many antibiotics which used to be very effective 30 years ago, which are almost totally inefficient now. There are many other forms of pathway to evolutionary explanations of disease, which I'm writing. OUP will be publishing later this year the first ever textbook of evolutionary medicine, Principles of Evolutionary Medicine, which I spent the last 3 years writing with my colleagues, but I won't bore you with all of that today. I want to focus on one, the most important, mismatch. And I'm annoyed at OUP because the hardcover book had a nice subtitle, How Our World No Longer Fits Our Bodies. They've done something silly on the paperback version, but I should say the paperback version is a better version because we did, like Charles Darwin, correct a few errors in going from the hardback to the paperback version. I'm short-sighted. I have to wear glasses. A fair number of you are short-sighted, even if you're not wearing glasses, you're wearing contact lenses or you've had laser surgery or whatever. What's going on there? If you looked at the Alaskan Inuit 100 years ago, or the Taiwanese farmers 100 years ago, not one of them was short-sighted. Now, 80 to 90% of Taiwanese people are short-sighted and have to wear glasses, and close to 100% of Inuits have to wear glasses. What's happened? In 100 years, we've gone from not needing glasses to everybody needing glasses. Now, what's going on? Eyes? I mean, these were meant to be the marvel, the epitome of Darwin raised it, as you know, the epitome of the example of the brilliance of evolution, even though it's the most crazy design. I mean, who would put the wires for a camera in front of the film and a blind spot in the middle? Just shows you how we have, we're effectively not a perfect design. We're a rather ramshackle design by committee almost. Why is it that the incidence of myopia, short-sightedness, has risen so much? Well, it turns out to be very simple. Myopia is caused by the eyeball growing the wrong length. So the focusing point of the lens isn't exactly on the back of the eyeball. And the eyeball grows very cleverly that when the light is focused on the back of the eyeball, it changes a growth factor in the eye, which changes the rate of growth of the eyeball. And so if it's focused right, it will grow in relationship to that focus. And of course, we lived in a world, and the Inuit lived in a world, and did till very recently, as did the Australian Aborigine. We're reading closely under artificial light was non-existent. The bulk of our eye use was at a greater distance. And in fact, it's recently been shown, in fact, by Hugh Mitchell, a professor of ophthalmology here in Australia, that if children grow up seeing the horizon for 2 hours a day, they never get short-sighted. But of course, children don't grow up seeing the horizon for 2 hours a day. They're in classrooms, they're reading under artificial light, etc., etc., etc. And it's quite clear that we are mismatched. We now have our eyes are designed to look out there at a distance. They're not designed to read my book. But you've got glasses, so you can. But the point I'm making is, here is an example. There is an evolved way in which the eye grew, so everybody had good focused eyes, because there was obviously an evolved advantage to have good eyes for distance focus 20, 30, whatever thousand years ago. We have put people into environments in the period while the eyes are growing, which are mismatched to how we were designed by the processes of evolution, and lo and behold, opticians do well. Let me give you another more tragic example. Humans evolved, as did all mammals, to drink their mother's milk. And when you were weaned from mother's milk, you went on to a broad mixture of foodstuffs that were in the environment. And weaning occurred somewhere between 2 to 3 years of age, as it still does in the few extant hunter-gatherer or forager societies. But we invented the cow, and companies worked out ways to make infant formula from cow's milk, and companies worked out ways to make money by selling infant formula. As you know, breast milk is more than just food. It contains all sorts of antibacterial and antiviral factors which protect babies from diarrhea, gastroenteritis, and the like. Even in the Western world, we can show, my colleague Chong Nap Seng in Singapore has just shown that even in modern upper-class people, breastfed children have less chest infections and colds in the first year of life than formula-fed children. So even in modern environments, that's the case. Well, companies like Nestle and others went into Africa in the 1970s and persuaded those emerging middle-class people that the sexy thing, if you're really up with it, up with the Joneses, and best for your baby, you would feed your baby on their magic formulas. And as you know, or may know, many thousands of babies died as a result of that, from gastroenteritis, pneumonias, other increased infections, because humans aren't designed to have cow's milk. Cows are designed to have cow's milk as children. We know until 10,000 years ago, no child had ever been exposed, no human had ever been exposed to cow's milk. And so here's another example of mismatch between our biology and the world we now live in, the world of infant formula. I can go on at length about that one, but I won't go into. In the book, Mark Hansen and I spend the first half of the book trying to explain the processes of evolution, the processes of development, the processes of forecasting, and the change in the nature of the world we live in since we largely evolved. And there are large ways in which the world has changed. If you accept that the bulk of human evolution occurred over the $5-7 million since the hominin clan arose in East Africa about 5 to 7 million years ago, we can debate the precise details. And modern human beings, anatomically modern human beings, appeared about 160 to 180,000 years ago in Africa. Until 10,000 years ago, there was no agriculture anywhere in the world, and there were no city dwellings or permanent population clusters anywhere in the world. Those two things, the change in food supply and the way we live socially, are the two biggest changes in our environment since the bulk of our evolution occurred. And because selection is a slow process, we're largely selected to live in a different nutrient world and in a different social environment to the environment we now live in. And the consequences of that play out on our lives. Add to that 20,000 years ago, our mean lifespan was only 33 years. And that sounds, and our mean lifespan, if you're a woman now, is about 85 years. For you in this room, it will be more, because you've already achieved a number of years. It'll be closer to 90 years. But believe it or not, in France, as recently as 1830, the mean lifespan for women was only 35 years. So between whenever we first evolved and 200 years ago, our average lifespans did not change very much. It went up a bit in some societies, particularly in upper middle class societies in Europe and North America, but on average, for average people, the lifespan did not change. Now it's changed dramatically, and of course that leads to new things appearing which we have never been selected not to have: Alzheimer's disease, osteoporosis, etc., etc., etc.